In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Harald, and I'll say a few words about him before I do. Harald Atmanspacher studied physics at Göttingen, Zurich, and Munich, and received his PhD in 1985. He's worked at the Max Planck Institute for Extraterrestrial Physics at Garching until 1998, and subsequently served as head of the theoretical division at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology at Freiburg until 2013. In 2007, he was elected as Associate Fellow at Collegium Helveticum and has been a member of its management board since 2014. In addition to a number of other academic positions, he is president of the Society for Mind Matter Research and editor of its journal Mind and Matter. His research activities cover the theory of complex systems, quantum foundations, and selected topics concerning mind-matter relations. So it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Harald, and Andrew is going to be controlling his slides. So there's going to be a tag team going on there. So Harald, over to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver, for this introduction, and thank you, David, for having me in your program this year. I want to talk about something that I think has been talked about by others before in this program, the different options for understanding relationships between the mental and the physical. That's the key point. And I will present one of these options in quite some detail, and that's the option that has been proposed by Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Gustav Jung in the 1950s. Essentially in the 1950s, Pauli being one of the great physicists of the last century, and Jung probably one of the greatest psychologists. So this is a unique collaborative effort, or it was, I should say, because usually when people talk about the mental and the physical in their relationship, this is mostly considered the job of philosophers, philosophy of mind. Nowadays, Jung and Pauli were different. And then in the second part of the talk, I will present to you two different types of implications that the conjecture by Pauli and Jung has. The first type is in clinical psychology, and that has to do with exceptional experiences or extraordinary experiences. You've heard about those before in this conference. And the second will be implications for cognitive science. And then I will wrap up what I said. Now, Andrew, can I have the first slide? That will be the title slide. And maybe the next one. Right, next one.
Yes.
What is a conjecture? Because I will talk about the Pauli-Jung conjecture. So a conjecture in mathematics is a hypothesis that is plausible but unproven. So it sounds okay, but nobody has proven it yet. And that's something that happens, that happened for many important theorems in mathematics. And of course, we all know that in philosophy, things never get really proven, but they just get, maybe more plausible. They get accepted, and then then there will be other ideas and previously accepted hypotheses fall back into the background or will be repressed or whatever. So the Pauli-Jung conjecture is one of these philosophical conjectures, not mathematical. And it is an approach to explore mind-matter relations or relationships that is called dual aspect approach. It's in the tradition of dual aspect thinking, proposed by Pauli and Jung in the 1950s. And it has been proposed by them as an alternative to one, interactive dualism. Second, as an alternative to idealism, different versions of idealism. And the third one, that would be the next slide, different versions of physicalism. I know that Ed has talked about physicalism in great length yesterday, so I will not do that. I will just say that there are different versions of physicalism, different versions of idealism. some reductive, some not reductive. And the alternative to all these three different ways of thinking about the mind-matter relationship has been called dual aspect approach. And the first protagonist in modern philosophy has been Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher. So much of the ideas, many of the ideas that Pauli and Jung developed have a strong relationship to the philosophy of Spinoza. Now the next slide. There are two different modes in which dual aspect thinking has been developed. The first one is what we call the compositional mode. And in the compositional mode, people assume that there are elements of reality which are psychophysically neutral, which means that they are neither mental nor physical. And when you configure or arrange these neutral elements in certain ways, then some of these ways lead you to mental elements or mental states or mental properties, and others lead you to physical properties. So this is, of course, in this compositional mode is reductive in the sense that you can reduce the mental and the physical configurations to psychophysically neutral elements and how they are configured. And this is, of course, inspired by classical system theory, where you have parts that you combine to wholes, and the wholes would be the mental configurations or the physical configurations. The major representatives of this compositional mode are the people that I have put here in brackets: Ernst Mach, William James, Bertrand Russell, and more recently, the neo-Russellian point of view of David Chalmers. And I will show you a quote by Russell, which shows you how Russell was really conceiving of this idea. This is a little bit of a lengthy quote. It has 2 slides. So this is the first one. And here Russell says, on the one hand, many psychologists, originally those of the behaviorist school, tend to adopt what is essentially a materialist position as a matter of method, if not of metaphysics. They, I mean the psychologists, make psychology increasingly dependent on physiology and external observation, and tend to think of matter as something much more solid and indubitable than mind. Meanwhile, the physicists, especially Einstein and other exponents of the theory of relativity, have been making matter less and less material. Whoever reads, for example, Eddington's Space-Time and Gravitation, a book of Eddington, will see that an old-fashioned materialism can receive no support from modern physics. Next slide. And he goes on and says, the view that seems to me to reconcile the materialistic tendency of psychology with the anti-materialistic tendency of physics, of the new physics, is the view of William James and the American New Realists, according to which the stuff of the world is neither mental nor material, but a neutral stuff out of which both are constructed. The stuff of which our experience is composed is, in my belief, neither mind nor matter, but something more primitive than either. Both mind and matter seem to be composite, and the stuff of which they are compounded lies in a sense between the two, in a sense above them both, like a common ancestor. And that's Russell in The Analysis of Mind, 1921, which is, of course, a completely different Russell than the Russell of, let's say, 20 years earlier. Here, Russell coins the notion of neutral monism, a monism which is neither idealist nor physicalist, neither based on the mental nor based on the physical or the material. So return, yes. That's the compositional mode. You have psychophysically neutral elements, and depending on how you configure them, they get either, the configurations get either mental or physical properties. Now the second mode, next slide, is of course the decompositional, as you can guess. In the decompositional mode, we do not start with psychophysically neutral elements, but with a psychophysically neutral whole. And depending on how you partition it, how you introduce distinctions, you get a mental and a physical domain. And that's, of course, not non-reductive, because you can't reduce parts to a whole, at least not in the classical thinking about reduction. And this is very much inspired by a notion that came up in quantum physics in the last century, quantum holism, quantum non-locality, issues like entanglement and so on. So the main exponents here are Pauli together with Jung. And the other one, which is closely related, actually, just works with a different terminology, is the approach by David Bohm together with Basil Hiley. Now, the next slide will just show you an artistic illustration of the Pauli-Jung conjecture, the Pauli-Jung dialogue, which contains a lot of symbolism. Pauli on the left-hand side, the real material Pauli and the real material Jung within the red triangle, and then you see them reflected or mirrored into a kind of transcendent, let's say, I don't know transcendent, but I should say into a background reality that would be the holistic reality in the blue triangles left and right. Next slide. In the next slide, I want to show you a brief quote which illustrates a little bit how Pauli actually came into contact with Jung. Because, I mean, both were living in Zurich at the time, early 1930s, but of course it's not usual for a physicist to go to a psychologist or the other way around, at least not in that time. But Pauli had a kind of series of neurotic events that he observed, but it was very easy to observe them in his life. And he contacted Jung actually for help, but Jung sent him to a young student, Anna Rosenbaum, and Pauli introduced himself to Rosenbaum in a letter like this, on a postcard actually. And he said, "I don't know who you are, old or young, physician or amateur psychoanalyst, completely unknown or very famous or something in between these extremes. I only know that Mr. Jung," let's see, I have to put something away here. "I only know that Mr. Jung quickly gave me your address and mentioned that I should write to you. The background is that I consulted Mr. Jung a week ago because of some neurotic symptoms, which among other things have to do with the fact that it is easier for me to achieve success in academia than with women." And now the next slide shows the next sentence in this postcard. "Since for Mr. Jung the opposite is the case, he seemed the right person to me to ask for medical advice." So this also shows the sarcastic humor that Pauli often expressed in discussion and conversation with colleagues and friends. So the next slide gives you kind of very schematic illustration of the dual aspect framework of thinking that Pauli and Jung developed. Here you see just a distinction between the mental and the material domain, or the physical domain, which results when you make a distinction in the holistic domain, which you see in the next slide, and you see it below the horizontal line. And this holistic domain in Pauli's and Jung's terminology was called the unus mundus, the one world, the one undivided world without distinctions. And that's populated by archetypes in Jung's terminology. And the way in which Jung approaches this unus mundus is via the collective unconscious. The way in which Pauli approaches it is holistic quantum reality. And the proposal is, or the idea really is, that the holistic quantum reality and the collective unconscious, at some point when you go deep enough toward ultimate holism, the distinction between collective unconscious and holistic quantum reality dissolves. So at the end, ultimately, you have only one world without any distinctions. Now, can we see this quote, Andrew? So what you see here is a very interesting parallel to the Russell quote I showed you before, but just 30 or 40 years later. and by someone else, by Wolfgang Pauli. On the one hand, Pauli says the unconscious can only be made accessible in an indirect way by its ordering influence on conscious contents. On the other hand, every observation of the unconscious, that is, every attempt to make unconscious contents conscious, has a prima facie uncontrollable reaction back onto these unconscious contents themselves. As is well known, this precludes that the unconscious can be exhaustively brought to consciousness, a position that Freud still held, but Jung departs from that. The physicist will, per analogy, conclude that precisely this uncontrollable backlash of the observing subject onto the unconscious limits the objective character of its reality and at the same time provides it with some subjectivity. Next slide. Then Pauli concludes, the development of microphysics has unmistakably led to a remarkable convergence of its description of nature with that of the new psychology, that is Jung's psychology, while the former, and this is becoming a very long sentence now, while the former, this is microphysics, due to the fundamental situation known as complementarity, faces the impossibility to eliminate actions of observers by determinable corrections and must therefore in principle relinquish the objective registration of all physical phenomena. The latter, that's the new psychology, could basically complement the merely subjective psychology of consciousness by postulating the existence of an unconscious of largely objective reality. So what you see in this quote, we can return to the main slides. What you see in this quote is something which is very much akin to what Russell said 30 years earlier, namely this kind of crossover between objectivity and subjectivity in physics and in psychology. It's very interesting. So at the end, of course, both Russell and also Pauli, they postulate this psychophysically neutral reality. The only difference being that Russell postulates it in terms of psychophysically neutral elements, and Pauli postulates it, and Jung, with a psychophysically neutral whole, an undivided universe. So next slide, I will show you some short list of some key features of this way of dual aspect thinking. The first one is the unus mundus is considered as one basic, ultimately basic, psychophysically neutral domain without distinctions such as the mental and the physical, subject, object, self and world, and I don't know what. Next one. The mental and the physical emerge as epistemic domains, as dual aspects, two aspects, which can be, for instance, described by a kind of symmetry breakdown of the holistic unus mundus. So the real reality would now be the unus mundus, the reality below the horizontal line, and the mental and the physical would be no longer, neither of them would be the real reality. They would just be aspects or perspectives through which we may get access to the real reality of the undivided world. Now, when you make this distinction between the mental and the physical, which arise from one and the same background reality, let me say, then of course automatically what you get are psychophysical correlations between the mental and the physical. And in the Pauli-Jung conjecture, these correlations are often described as synchronicities. I don't think I have to say much about what a synchronicity is. You probably know this and have read about this a lot. But these correlations reflect in some sense the lost holism of the unus mundus. And why lost? Because the mental and the physical are already a kind of distinction in that holism. So the holism is not 100% left anymore. Now the next slide. That's one of the many, let's say, descriptions of psychophysical correlations in the Pauli-Jung conjecture. They are often expressed symbolically and they are always expressed as meaningful correspondences. So the notion of meaning really becomes something which is very, very essential in this picture here. And the correlations are neither causal. So the correlation between a mental event and a physical event cannot be explained by a kind of causal relation between them. The brain doesn't cause consciousness, or consciousness doesn't cause the brain. And they're also not random. So they are somehow there without being just by chance. And they are experienced by the experiencing subject in terms of the meaning that relates the mental and the physical event. That is a radical proposal, that meaning comes into play here. And the notion of meaning is, of course, something that fits exactly the dual aspect framework, because meaning is always a relational kind of, let's say, what is it? It's a relational term. So you always need to have two positions at least to put in meaning as the relation between them. For instance, you have a mental representation. That representation represents something, and what it represents, the link to what it represents is given by the meaning of that representation. In the philosophy of mind, this kind of meaning is sometimes technically called intentionality, but I don't want to go into that. The next one. So in dual aspect approaches, psychophysical correlations are relations between the self model, that would be the mental aspect, and the world model, that would be the physical aspect of a subject, or maybe of a kind of set of subjects, a population or whatever, depending on how well developed these different kinds of models are. Now, there is a very interesting structural analogy between this kind of mind and matter concept and quantum theory, which I will show you in the next slide. So that's what we have in quantum physics. In quantum physics, we have, at the bottom, we have entangled states. And in quantum mechanical terms, these entangled states are not product states. So you cannot write them, that's the inequality sign, as a product of two disentangled states. You can, so if you write them as a product of such states, then you have already destroyed the entanglement. And that's what you see on the upper line here. You have psi1 and psi2, and the remnant of the lost holism in the entanglement situation can be seen, or also can be measured in terms of correlations. And again, these correlations are, of course, they are not random. They are very, very rigorous, but they are also not causal. They are acausal. So psi1 doesn't influence psi2 in order to establish a correlation, and psi2 doesn't influence psi1 in order to establish a correlation. And in physics, these correlations can be very precisely measured, and then you can analyze these measurements in terms of statistics, and can find that these correlations really exist. Now the next slide, lower half of it, will show you the analogy to mind-matter relations. So in mind-matter relations, this is a kind of pullback metaphor in a sense. So what you could say is we try to use material concepts, structures from a well-known domain of knowledge, that would be quantum physics, and pull it down into a new territory of which we don't know a lot, but we try to explore whether the same structure, the same concepts give us meaning in this new territory. The new territory being the mind-matter relationship. Now, the role of the entangled state is now the psychophysically neutral. The psychophysically neutral whole, and that disentangles into the mental and the physical. And again, we have acausal correlations. So the mental doesn't cause the physical does not cause the mental, but they are correlated. And the correlations are not random. Now, the big difference from physics now is that we don't have any idea, also not the tools, to measure these correlations in terms of statistics. Why? Because these correlations are substantiated by the meaning that a subject in a certain mental state experiences about these correlations. And now one of the big questions is, of course, how can we do science with these with this concept of mind-matter relations if we cannot measure and identify these correlations in a statistical way? And that will that leads me to the next slide. That leads me to the to a kind of model in which Pauli and Jung try to talk about these psychophysical correlations and distinguish different types of them. And essentially there are two types. One type of psychophysical correlations that we all know very well are structural and persistent correlations. These correlations are, for instance, psychosomatic correlations. If you're put under stress, then your heart rate will increase. Or we can talk about neural correlates of consciousness. These are structural and persistent. And I can say already, these will also be easy to reproduce. And over and above these psychophysically, these structurally persistent correlations, we also have induced correlations. And these correlations appear occasionally. They are depending on certain contexts, and they are definitely not structural in the sense that they are just there. The next point will be what I indicated already. The structural correlations are persistent and robustly reproducible. Induced correlations are occasional, evasive, and irreproducible. And most of the phenomena that Jung described as synchronicities belong to the second type, to the induced correlations. And the late Jung made a move toward accepting psychosomatic relations also as certain kinds of synchronicity. But of course, these structural correlations, like psychosomatic ones, are not something where you ascribe a lot of meaning to, right? That's the point where meaning comes into play again. Next one. So since the structural correlations are so well reproducible and persistent, you can consider them as providing a baseline from which the other ones, the occasional ones, the induced correlations, deviate. And the next one shows you how they can deviate. Of course, they can deviate above and below the baseline. So you can have positive and negative deviations, and the positive ones are excess correlations. The negative ones are deficit correlations. So that the excess correlations would appear in experiences of coincidence. The deficit correlations would appear as experiences of dissociation. So dissociation, like in out-of-body experiences or sleep paralysis or whatever, where some parts of your mental life that are usually always connected become disconnected. And the opposite is the case in excess correlations. Next one. So both excess and deficit correlations are experienced as meaningful because actually they deviate from the baseline of ordinary correlations between the self model and the world model. So the luminosity that Jung often requested for or demanded for true synchronicity, that's an extreme deviation from the baseline. And the ordinary case of structural correlations would just be no deviation from the baseline. They are the baseline. So how can we map that into the experience of exceptional experiences? That's the next question. Let me check time. Okay. So here is a kind of taxonomy or typology, if you want. Typology is a misleading term for Jungians. So taxonomy of 4 different types of exceptional experiences that can be, that actually follow from the Pauli-Jung conjecture, that are implied by the Pauli-Jung conjecture. So when you look at the horizontal axis here in this graph, you see internal phenomena and external phenomena. Internal phenomena would be deviations in the self model, within the self model. That's the mental aspect. External phenomena would be deviations in the world model. That would be deviating experiences from in the physical domain. Deviating from what? For instance, deviating from the laws of nature that we usually apply to the physical world. So all kinds of poltergeist phenomena, flying stuff, flying knives in the room and stuff like that would be deviations in the world model. These would be external phenomena. Whereas hearing voices or something like that, getting commands from an internal kind of agent that cannot be ascribed to anything like in the external world, these would be deviations in the self model. And on the vertical axis, you see the distinction between coincidence phenomena and dissociation phenomena that I mentioned before. Coincidence phenomena being due to the connection of ordinarily disconnected elements of self-model and world model, like extrasensory perception, synchronicities in the narrow sense. And dissociation phenomena would be experienced as disconnections of ordinarily connected elements. So just the opposite of self-model and world model. And of course, this is the paradigm example here is, I think, out-of-body experiences, where the relation of mindness becomes disconnected. So the mindness of my body gets all of a sudden experienced as something that is not mine anymore. It's disconnected from the agent, from the mental state of the agent that experiences these out-of-body experiences. So the next slide. Yeah, now we come to the question of empirical access. Now the implications of the Pauli-Jung conjecture that I described to you up to now, this is all fine. And this is a model that has a lot of advantages against other philosophical positions. But now one of the crucial questions is, how can it, or can it at all, be supported by anything like empirical material? And I was happy enough to have a good colleague at the Institute for Frontiers of Psychology at Freiburg, Wolfgang Fach. And Wolfgang Fach and his group at that institute, they keep collecting cases of and reports of exceptional experiences for more than 20 years now. So they have a huge repertoire, a huge stack of case reports, more than 2,300 by now. And there are additional reports that we get access to from other places, like the Psychiatric University Hospital in Zurich and places in the US, and others. University of Gießen is collecting cases like that now. And with these reports of exceptional experiences, if they are documented well enough, then you can try to put them under kind of an analytic scrutiny. And that is the next point on this slide. You can systematically investigate the phenomenology of these experiences with factor analyses, cluster analyses, and whatnot. Important here is the analysis concerns the phenomenology of the experiences. So the analysis relies just on how subjects report what they experience. It does not rely on what physicalists would call the veridicality of this experience. So the question, do they really describe something out there in the world? Because out there in the world, in the dual aspect monist's mind does not exist. There is no physical world out there. The physical world is just an aspect, I'm repeating myself, from which, an aspect or a perspective, I should say, from which we can see the real reality, the holistic reality under the horizontal line of that other scheme before. So now all these different cases that we investigated, by now probably more than even 2,500, they support the four-pattern classification or the four-pattern taxonomy suggested by the Pauli-Jung conjecture. So that's an extreme confirmation, or at least extreme support for that kind of framework of thinking. And the next slide is that the distribution over the four patterns is comparable for different subsamples. So it does not depend on whether people come from Switzerland or from Freiburg or from Georgia or from other places in Western civilizations. We did not do analyses so far on Eastern spiritual contexts, people from there. That's something for the future. And we are trying to set up some collaboration with Tanja Luhrmann at Stanford, who has comparably large samples of exceptional experiences from other cultural contexts. And that's something for the future. And the next line here will be last. This is another interesting point. We have developed together with people from the Psychiatric University Hospital in Zurich. We have developed some psychophysical studies which can provide even more information than the pure taxonomy. For instance, we have tools now which allow us to identify individuals within the coincidence, disposition within the total sample. So we have, of course, in a total sample, we have all four types, but there are now tests with which we can identify individuals in the total sample that have the coincidence disposition and not the other four, the other three dispositions. And these tests are laboratory tests. That's quite an interesting side effect here. Next one. This slide shows you a very compact representation of the whole material, of the analysis results of the material as a whole that we have studied so far. And you see here on the right upper side, you see a list of 6 different samples. One of them is the Freiburg sample, the uppermost IGPP. Then we have one sample with about 100 people with near-death experiences. Then we have another huge set of experienced meditators. Then we have number 4, students from the general population. And we have the Swiss online study also with people from the general population, more than 1,500. And then we have one sample from, I think it's the University of West Georgia, USA. Now, the graph itself, again, shows you these 4 patterns of the taxonomy. And the circles in this graph show you how often people in these respective samples report experiences in the direction of these 4 different patterns, these 4 different basic classes of the taxonomy. And what you see here is that the highest frequencies up to, I think 0.5 is almost never, no, 0 is never, 0.5 is almost never, 1 would be rarely, 1.5, and so it increases. So the people, the subjects with highest frequencies are not very astonishingly the subjects from the near-death experiences sample and from the meditators. And of course, as you can also expect, the lowest frequencies we get from the general population, the student sample, and the Swiss general population sample. So that's again a kind of demonstration that you can do a lot of real science based on this Pauli-Jung conjecture, which so far has confirmed one basic implication of this conjecture. That's the implication of the taxonomy that I presented to you. And now in the remaining, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes, let's say 10, I will sketch out for you a second implication. That's the one that I mentioned in the beginning as the implication for cognitive science. And if you go to the next slide, this is a kind of short recapitulation of what it means to make an observation in physics. And you will see on the coming slide that there is a close parallel to what happens in psychology and cognitive science. And this parallel has been tested in several kind of examples, and I will come to that. So observations in physics essentially are interactions of an observing system with an observed system. The observed system is in a certain state, and there are certain observables, properties that are associated with that state, and those properties are the object of the observation. Now, there are two different cases that you can distinguish. The first case is the interaction between observing system and observed system is very weak, and that means we have no significant effect of the observing system on the observed system. And the interaction in point 2 can be strong, so the observing system leaves an effect on the observed system, so this effect really makes a difference. That's actually the back reaction of the observation onto the observed system that, if you remember, that was one point in the long Pauli quote before. Next. In physics, these two different cases, 1 and 2, are distinguished in the physics terminology as the classical case in 1 and the quantum case in 2. And the classical case is best characterized by the law of commutativity with respect to the observables. So whether you measure B first or A first doesn't make a difference. And the quantum case is characterized by the violation of commutativity. So the observables form a set that is not commutative. And in that case, the sequence of the observations makes a difference. Why? Because measuring the first observable, the first property, leaves an effect on the system state. So when you measure the second observable, you measure it already on a different state. So that makes it very plausible that the measurement sequence makes a difference. Next. So this is another nice quote from Wolfgang Pauli, and he illustrates this kind of the quantum case by saying the observer in quantum physics brings forth considerable trouble in nature, trouble really, without being able to influence its unpredictable outcome and results which afterwards can be objectively checked by everyone. Just to illustrate this non-commutative nature of measurements. Trouble in nature. On the next slide, we will briefly see the same story for now, not for physics, but for psychology. Now in psychology, it is very plausible that almost every action of an observing system entails a significant effect on an observed system. If I ask any of you about your mental state, then of course, the question alone will bring you into a different mental state. And when you output an answer, then again, your mental state will change. So a strong interaction between observing and observed system is expected to be the rule rather than the exception in psychology. Next. Yeah, so as in physics, in quantum physics, I should say, as in quantum physics, observing a mental state does not only mean to record a value of an observable, it also means, in addition, to change the state of the subject or the state of the observed system. And this means, as in quantum physics, the results of successive observations are sequence dependent. Measurements are non-commutative operations. So when I measure something, when I give you a question, you give an answer, Then I give you a second question, you give an answer again, and I revert the sequence of the questions. Then the general case will be that the second question will be answered differently. So this basic idea has turned into a research program in cognitive science, which some people like Jerry Boosmeyer in Bloomington, Indiana, they have coined the notion of quantum cognition. We can debate about this notion, but the idea is really that we have to do with measurements as non-commutative operations, and that's very much the same as in quantum physics. Of course, the systems are different. We're talking about mental systems now, and the observables are different. Next slide. And so this program of quantum cognition is now running for, let's say, about 20 years. And there have been numerous successful investigations and applications which people came up with, beginning with something like bistable perception. There is a very comprehensive model for bistable perception that has been developed in our lab. It's called the Necker-Zeno model, for those of you who may have heard about it. Then decision processes and order effects in questionnaires. That's the area of research which Jerry Boosmeyer and colleagues, who I mentioned before, have been working on very strongly, very strong results, very nice results. Rich Schifrin also involved there. Learning in networks, it's an interesting application. If you let a network learn certain outputs to certain responses to a question, which would be outputs responding to an input, then what you realize when you study these learning processes is that the network not only learns to relate the right output to the right input, the network also learns the sequence in which it learned the input-output relation. So when you change the sequence in the recognition task, then the network fails to give you the right outputs. That's also a very interesting application of non-commutativity. Concept combinations in linguistic semantics is an interesting application that Peter Brusa and colleagues have pioneered in Australia, Brisbane, and there are many others by now. So this is another very, I think, substantial application of dual aspect thinking. Why? Because if dual aspect thinking, dual aspect monism holds some truth, then the basic structures that we observe in physics, in the physical aspect, should also somehow appear in the mental aspect. And the basic structure that I'm talking about here is, of course, the non-commutativity of measurements of observables. Brief summary at the end. The Pauli-Jung conjecture is the postulate of a dual aspect monism picture with the mental and the physical as complementary dual aspects. There are two types of meta correlations in this picture. One type is structural. The correlations are persistent and reproducible. The other type is induced. The correlations are occasional and evasive. The ordinary structural baseline correlations, the ordinary structural correlations form a baseline. So we have baseline correlations that are reproducible, and there are induced deviations above and below the baseline. The Pauli-Jung conjecture gives rise to systematic and empirically supported taxonomy or typology of exceptional experiences. And finally, it predicts non-commutative processes in psychology as a natural consequence. So, oh yeah, I see. There's a book that we published a few years ago based on a workshop on the Pauli-Jung conjecture that was organized by myself with Chris Fuchs at Boston. And it contains This is just a selection. It contains paper by Joe Cambray, the president of the Pacifica Institute, Thomas Filk, a physics professor in Freiburg, Chris Fuchs himself, Roderick Main at Essex, Bill Seeger, University of Toronto, Hans Christian von Baer, who wrote some interesting popular books on quantum Bayesianism, Beverly Zabriskie, a Jungian psychoanalyst in New York City, and many others. I think, yeah, you can buy it from Imprint Academic. It's very cheap, just not even $30. And with that, I thank you all for your attention, and I'm ready to get your questions.
Thank you so much, Harald. Really appreciate covering such complex territory with such clarity. So it's time. We've got about 12 minutes for questions before we have our breakout rooms. And in terms of questions, I'll initially prioritize people who've not had an opportunity to ask a question yet this morning, and we'll see how we get on. So Jan Ringelstein.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me. Thanks a lot, Professor Atmanspacher, for this presentation. Unfortunately, I couldn't view the most of it because I had to leave for an emergency. However, I have a very strong feeling that this is exactly the way we should go in research and in researching consciousness with scientific methods. And I have a strong feeling that really I should take part in that. So my question is, in your opinion, what is the next step? Where do we need to go? Do we need more scientists? Do we need more disciplines? Do we need better experiments, better theory? What is your opinion on that?
I would say, in the best of all worlds, everything.
Yes, naturally.
Okay. No, I would, maybe I answered this with saying more than actually you wanted to know. I think very generally in philosophy, whenever you have an interesting approach that can explain something, then this is usually not a free lunch. You run into problems at other sides, like physicalism has many problems, has celebrated many successes, but it has also problems. Idealism has the same, and this is also the case for dual aspect monism. We have dual aspect monism gives you a great thing, namely that correlations between the mental and the physical are for free. You just get them out of distinguishing the undivided whole into aspects. That means you must have correlations, right? No other philosophical position can really, or has so far explained these correlations in a fundamental way. They're just always postulated somehow, or empirically demonstrated, of course, but they are not part of a theoretical model. Now, the big price that we have to pay, and that brings me to your question, or closer to your question, in dual aspect thinking, is that we don't know a lot, or maybe we know almost nothing about the undivided reality, the archetypes, the level of the archetypes, and so on. Mm-hmm. And I would see, and that's also something I'm working on right now with colleagues, try to specify the structure of this this holistic reality, which is neither mental nor physical, below the horizontal line in this one picture. And that has to do also with explorations into the notion of meaning. I mean, meaning in philosophy is a term which, if you ask 50 philosophers what they think about meaning, you get 50 different answers maybe. So what we're trying to do is we try to identify the most crucial approaches to meaning in philosophy, and then we try to find out how they relate to the notion of meaning as it is used in the Pauli-Jung conjecture, and maybe in close relatives. So what you see in these responses to your question is that my answer actually reflects my kind of, actually it reflects my being a theoretician, right? So I would always say in territory that is so difficult to explore as the territory of mind-matter relations. You cannot, I mean, of course you can do experiments and you can collect experiences and something, but if you don't have a theoretical guiding idea, this is just like, you know, in the forest. There may be interesting results here and there, but you don't know how to systematize them. You don't know how to bring them into contact. And that's why we think it's so important to have this taxonomy, because when you look back into science 200 years from now, then in the field of botany, for instance, the first progress that people made in studying plants was a taxonomy. And then from there you go. And what I'm saying at the same time when I say this is that, you know, the study of psychophysical correlations is now in a state in which botany was 200 years ago. And I think this is true. We are really at the beginning with this, right?
Only motivates me more because there's so much to find out.
Oh yeah, yeah, very much so.
Great,
Thank
great
you very
answer.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bernard.
Thank you. Harold, thank you for a very nice talk. I was particularly impressed with your diagram where you showed the frequency of exceptional experiences, you know, with internal versus external, coincidence versus association. But I have a question about that. And the question is, how do you distinguish between internal and external? I mean, for example, within psychical research, if I see a ghost, there's a controversy as to whether that's something internal, you know, generated by the mind and hallucination, or whether it's something external, which can be which can be photographed, for example.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So there seems to be a sort of ambiguity. And the other aspect of that diagram was the frequencies themselves, because in psychical research, you sort of have the impression that physical phenomena are much rarer than mental phenomena. I mean, so people may have lots of out-of-body experiences, but they don't often physically levitate. So, and yet your diagram is rather symmetric between internal
and external. It's symmetric. It's not symmetric between coincidence and dissociation, as you saw, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I was interested in the internal versus external.
Yeah, okay. So first point is that the way we ascribe a certain experience to internal, either internal or external, is purely based on the description of the report of the subject. So, of course, this has to be scrutinized, right? So when the subject gives us the feeling that it is really seeing the ghost as an external phenomenon, then of course you can often you can take that from the report. Vis-a-vis the situation where the subject says this ghost was just something that gives me commands how to do this and do that. That would more fall into the internal side. So you have to listen very closely to the phenomenology of the experiences as the subject gives it to you. Okay. And then you can say it goes here and goes there. And you know, I'm not sure. You know, you say that there is a kind of a different perception in psychical research that external phenomena happen not so often. And that may have to do simply with the way in which people ascribe phenomena to external and internal. That may have to do with it. We don't see it with our methods of ascription.
Okay, but that's fine, because your analysis is based on how people report it rather than the sort of ontological.
Oh yeah, no, very much so. And it cannot be different. Why? Because for us, the external is not really some kind of outside physical reality. The external is also an aspect. It's also a model. It's the world model, if you want.
Yeah.
Right. So it cannot be ontological. It's a model.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Annalisa Borello, your question. Annalisa, are you there? You have to unmute.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. I was wondering how the discipline of anthropology can inform your research, or if there's been any collaboration with anthropologists, because you mentioned you don't have data on Eastern
That's right. Yeah.
Spiritual experiences, but that's not what you said. But
Yeah, no.
you only have data based on Western individuals.
That's right, yes.
But there is a lot of research in anthropology about shamanism and animism and experiences that feel alien to us.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another question, and which is, where are psychotropic substances classified in your model? Are they considered or not? And finally, when people do practices that change homeostasis, i.e. changing their physiology in order to achieve this altered state of consciousness, again, where do they fit in the model?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
The first thing about anthropology, I'm not sure whether I mentioned that or not, but we are in close contact with Tanja Luhrmann now from Stanford, and she is an anthropologist. She studies exactly what you are asking for, namely exceptional experiences in other cultural contexts. And she's just, I think last year she did a huge excursion into several states in Africa. And we are just, we are in the first steps of establishing this collaboration. And one of the first steps, of course, must be to compare the taxonomies that we have. And so, for instance, ask the question, can the taxonomies, I mean, it's very unlikely that they are the same in the beginning because she developed hers from a completely different viewpoint. But the question then is, can we find relations between the different classes that appear in the taxonomy? And then, of course, if that's possible, then we have a great chance really to look into different cultural contexts with our model as well. So psychotropic substances, we didn't study so far at all, because what we are, we try to really look at experiences as they happen spontaneously, not under drugs, and also not in certain kinds of lab studies, something like that. So we really want to study these people with their spontaneous experiences. And in the questionnaires that we give the people, we also ask, there's one specific question is whether they use something like psychotropic substances. And then we do not consider those cases in our samples, okay? And what was the third one?
I don't know. I think Andrew might have to unmute it, but I think we've only got a little bit of time left, so okay. that was helpful. Thanks. We can come back to all these topics in the plenary after the breakout rooms. I'm going to bring in Brian Josephson, physicist to physicist. Brian, if you can unmute.
Brian, I think you unmuted yourself and then maybe muted yourself again. If you can unmute yourself, there we go. Got it.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, well, first I want to say that what you're saying is in line with what we're doing. We're actually, we have ideas about how you can do the theory. But I also had a particular question on, you talked about symmetry breaking, and I was wondering what you meant by that.
Yeah, so far this is a metaphor, but we know what symmetry breaking is in physics. We know it very well. And I made this brief indication that, of course, you can, when you have something like a hole, then you can, a hole in a very general sense is a state in which you have something like full symmetry, which means nothing is distinguished from anything else. Right? Or did I say that right? You cannot distinguish anything. So you have total invariance in some sense. Now when you break that invariance up, then you get different domains, and these domains are correlated. And of course, if we talk about this unus mundus kind of reality, then the symmetry breakdown can only be spontaneous. It cannot be induced because there is not something that can induce it, right? So that would be as close I can come to the physical situation. Of course, we also know that in physical symmetry breakdowns often induce correlations between the parts that emerge. Long-range correlations, like in quantum field theory, Nambu, Goldstone bosons, and stuff like that. So this is, but this is all physics. Now what we are interested in developing is a picture that pulls as much as possible from the structure that we know in physics into the mind-matter issue. And that was my response already to one of the previous questions. We don't really know how to do it yet. I mean, we have some ideas to go, but we are not there yet. We're far from there yet.
Well, a point I made in some of my writings is that we've got a two-culture situation, and there's something called biosemiotics, which does study how meaning works in biology, and we're sort of working from ideas there. There's also coordination dynamics. So there are lots of ideas there.
Ryan, there is a lot of noise in your microphone. Can you? I just didn't get what you said. Biosemiotics I heard, and then I was off.
Oh, coordination dynamics.
Okay.
Or something else. So there are ideas if you look on the other side of the water.
Great. Well, I think we can squeeze in one more quick one, and I'm going to ask Vasileios to contribute this. Tuvi, Marco, and Jean. Hopefully, we can bring you in after the breakout rooms. Vasileios.
Oh, okay, thanks, and thanks for the great lecture. Also, greetings for your old group of endophysics that we have met in Tübingen in 2005. Some of these people are in the audience, and I'm also speaking on behalf of them. That was a great lecture. Thank you. So, a quick question. Pauli was very much interested well, famous also for his Pauli exclusion principle. Did this line of thinking influence about his work with Jung on the duality between psychic and physical?
So the exclusion principle was formulated by Pauli in 1925. That was before he even met Jung the first time. So there's no influence that direction. But in retrospect, when Pauli learned about Jungian archetypes and all this kind of stuff in Jungian psychology, he made a connection backward from that to the exclusion principle, because among the archetypes, I mean, when you read Jung, then the most basic archetypes are the number archetypes. And Jung would talk about duality, about trinity and quaternity and stuff like that. And Pauli, in retrospect, interpreted his path to the exclusion principle as the introduction of a new fourth quantum number, which he didn't call spin, but other people call it spin then. And so he interpreted he interpreted his discovery backward as the step from the 3 from trinity to the 4 to quaternity. So he always, you know, when you read Pauli's correspondence, you always see how he tries to relate what he discovers in Jung with his own discoveries in physics. So that would be one example.
But he didn't relate synchronicity or semantics with the life of an electron or a photon. I mean, does a photon have a will or a sense of time?
No, that's another good point. What you are just outlining is the position of the panpsychists. For the panpsychists, everything, even electrons, have mental properties, right? Like you just mentioned the will. But for the panpsychist also has he has a kind of reality which is somehow akin to the psychophysically neutral in Pauli Jung, but it's not really psychophysically neutral, because while Pauli and Jung would say their unus mundus is neither mental nor physical, the panpsychist would say it's both mental and physical, which is logically different, right? So the panpsychist would say in nature, no matter how far you go down to rocks, to electrons, to quarks, whatever, there is always some mental property. Whatever has material properties, it also has mental properties. But that would be different from the Pauli-Jung way of looking at things. So the panpsychist is different from the neutral monist.
Sounds like there's lots of discussion that could be had there. And I'm sure I can see Valeos brewing with further questions. But that's, thank you so much, Harald, and thanks so much to those of you who asked questions. As I say, there will be more time for questions because we have a little plenary after the breakout rooms. Andrew, do you want to do the breakout room magic?
Sure. I'm opening up the breakout rooms now. So everyone, you'll see an invitation on your screen. Just accept that if you want to go into a room, and if you don't wish to, that's fine. Just don't accept the invitation.
So, and we are back on the general discussion in 10 minutes or something?
That's right, yes.
Exactly, yes.
We're back here.
Oh, 10 minutes, okay.
So Peter and Harald, if you want to just check that you're unmuted.
Yes, now I am.
Peter, are you with us?
Oh, yes, now I am.
So Peter, I'm going to take an opportunity to just ask you something. And that's the matter of agency, which I'm sure, you know, something that you must get asked about quite a lot. And so it seems to me quite pertinent at the moment, because it seems to me that agency as a feature of normal consciousness is enormously important for organizing society and morals. Even for simple ethical precepts like sexual consent is premised on the idea of agency. You know, you either do or something is done to you without consent. And of course, how governments behave towards their citizens, because governments can either do things in such a way that emphasizes individual agency, so it gives people choice and empowerment, or they simply coerce them into doing things, which is sort of anti-agency. So how do we square the importance, the central, immovable importance of agency to a well-constructed society and a set of morals, and that it seems to be absent in these higher states of consciousness you talk about?
Thank you. That is a fantastically good question, and it's going to have a yes and answer. In other words, it won't be totally satisfactory. Let's look at it from the point of the person who's non-dual. And let's go back to what they actually say, and we can work on from there. Raise your hand. And I do. Now, my own perception of that, your perception of that, was that you issued a command of some sort and your hand raised up. They're non-dual. So there is no self there which is acting on anything. So what is the actor and what produces the movement? The actor is the perception of the moment, and the perception of the moment is the reality that is, which bubbles up and decays. So what they see is that coming out of the perception of the moment is a hand raised, and it's their hand. So they don't have agency to do it. It's done, in fact, by their perception of reality. Now, when you go on to discuss the wider implications of this, it gets really quite murky, because it's difficult to know. I'd be able to give you a much better answer if I was totally non-dual myself. But let's look at what others have said. Rupert Sparrow's got quite far in non-duality. And if you ask Rupert how things are, he will say that that's just not a meaningful question. They appear and disappear. And he doesn't do anything to help it. So he will also go on to say that it's a sort of mirage we have, that we're actually doing things In other words, it's a self-construct, it's a filter. It is the ego which filters reality in such a way as to give you a meaning. It's not there at all. So then you ask, does this mean that there is some master plan for the evolution of everything and it goes this way? It's actually quite difficult to get away from that view without putting individual agency in, which doesn't seem to occur. So it's a sort of yes and answer rather than, or yes but answer than a straightforward one.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing there is that I think it's very difficult to go from there to any to premises for how, as I say, to organize a set of ethics or a society with agency at the center. For example, you can't simply do away with the distinction between rape and consensual sex. You know, I don't think that's appropriate, and that fundamentally requires the notion of doing or being done to. You know, it's either you, so you can't have that distinction without agency. Now, I appreciate that this is enormously difficult to reconcile, but I kind of wonder whether there's, you know, there was certainly a lot of chat during your talk about, you know, whether or not there's scope for a sort of both and maybe, but which is of course, you know, something which seems to be integral to non-dual. It never precludes things, but it's includes opposites.
But you come down to the final question: is this all just a dance of perception in some sort of way, and that our idea that we're actually doing anything is in itself a false notion? Now, if you accept that, then the dance will go on, whether we think we are contributing to it directly or not. And it means that a lot of what we think we're doing, we're not. And if you take that view, then to be silent in the moment and see what arises is what it is. And what arises is, and that's it. And so you can't, in fact, tell stories to yourself that you are, in fact, constructing something amazing when something amazing is just arising. It's a bit unsatisfactory from the level of the story. The level of the story, it's mad. From the level of just perception without a perceiver, it's how things are. So it's a nice question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And if anyone would like to ask a question, or who was, you know, and that includes anyone who was previously going to ask, feel free to put up your hand. In the absence of hands at the moment, Harald, a quick one for you. You said that materialism was a busted flush in physics for about 100 years now, that really materialism can't be supported by physics sort of ever since relativity.
That's what Russell said, actually.
Yeah, would you adhere to that as well?
I mean, from the point of view of today, I would say that even more than Russell said it. Of course, there are different kinds of physicalism.
Indeed.
And I think one of the major distinctions between the different kinds would be the one between reductive physicalism and non-reductive physicalism. And I think reductive physicalism by today is even ruled out within physics now. Because all the examples for reduction in physics that philosophers of science brought up in the 1960s and 70s have all been proven false now. I mean, the philosophical perspective is often not fine-grained enough to look into all the details that are necessary to describe a situation properly. And if you don't do that, you can easily be misguided to call something reduction in physics, like temperature to the motion of molecules, something like that. And simply when you take care of the details, it doesn't work that way. And the alternative of non-reductive physicalism, I think, is much more powerful in the sciences, but even that, I would say, doesn't reach the phenomenality of consciousness. And many people agree with me now in the philosophy of mind. Non-reductive physicalism relaxes the notion of reduction, or even rules it out, or doesn't consider it, And then, of course, you can ask, what does non-reductive physicalism, how do they replace the reduction? And of course, the key notion here is emergence, right? And then again, emergence again comes in different varieties. There's weak emergence, there's strong emergence, there's epistemic emergence, there's ontological emergence. So this really gets a very complicated landscape. But even in non-reductive physicalism, many people would today argue that the phenomenality of consciousness cannot be reached by even that relaxed notion of physicalism.
Yep, thank you. Tuvi.
Who's that?
I've just asked Tuvi for a question.
First of all, thank you very much. I really enjoy your presentation of the model. And I would like to continue what Oli asked, because that was exactly my question. Oli took half of my question to Peter, but it's related to both of you. And because, and I'll connect the question to both of you. About the, first of all, just one comment that it's very similar to the implicate order of David Bohm, because implicate is like the wholeness, that the unconscious that we cannot see. It's very, very similar. But my question is, I very much want to add to what Oli asked, and this is a question to both Peter, Oli asked Peter, but also you. I think that you also mentioned about breaking symmetry, and I believe there is important role of will, of the will, the agency, intention, purpose. And if just in 1 minute about my model, that there is I think the unividual is very nice model. And Peter, who already teaching, and I can tell you one of the best person in the world that I never met, and I learned a lot from Peter. And he's teaching us exactly how to get to this enlightenment and to beyond the individual. But I believe there is a special role for this, for the agency that Oli mentioned. Because I can see the whole, there is one whole, but all of us are neurons, are agency of this whole. And we can be part of the whole, but at the same time, we still have got the agency. And there is reason for this. And the reason for this is the creativity. And it's not just random, it's not something that's a coincidence that happened. So, so my question to you, what is really the purpose, and how in this model, how do you see the will of the person? How do you see the purpose, both of the individual and the purpose of all the universe of the whole? Because we are part of the whole. So what is the purpose and what is the role of intention, free will in this model?
So is that something for me now, or is it something?
I think it's to both.
Starting with you, yes, yes.
For me, okay. Oh, there's a real lot to say about that, and I'm just trying to find the best way to present or to outline what I think about this. Maybe let me begin with this. When Pauli and Jung developed their thinking, they were very much almost, let me say, under the spell of post-Kantian thinking. Post-Kantian means that there is a kind of empirical reality, maybe mental or physical or whatever, something that you can empirically access. And then there is what Kant called a transcendental realm, which he called the transcendental ideality, as opposed to reality. And for Kant, this was the realm of things in themselves and stuff like that. And Kant, as well as later Pauli and Jung, they were committed to the view that there is no empirical access whatsoever possible to the transcendental. You can only get a glimpse of the transcendental by its manifestations in the empirical world, right? So there's no access into this kind of transcendental, as Kant called it, world. Now, Pauli remained convinced of this until he died. Jung, however, in his last major work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, which he finished something in the late 1960s or something like that, I guess. Jung died in 1972. In the Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung explores possibilities, I mean conceptual possibilities, to think of something, of some kind of procedures to enter this kind of transcendental realm by experience, Now, the important point now is this experience cannot be discursive or cognitive or something like that. It's just the raw experience of something that is not given to us in the empirical domains of the mental and the physical. And for instance, Deleuze has written about this. Deleuze was an expert on both Jung and also Spinoza, and Deleuze suggested to replace the notion of the transcendental, a la Kant, by the notion of immanence, and he called these experiences immanent experiences. So immanent experiences are not discursive, they are not cognitive, they don't follow the laws of logic, of our everyday logic. And that's of course something which from our side comes in, sideways in a way, because when we talk about a non-commutative structure, then this implies, as we know from quantum mechanics, this implies mathematically that the logic of propositions about such measurements that are non-commutative has to be non-Boolean. So you cannot talk about this, and this of course rings the bell of non-duality. If you're Boolean, then there's always the tertium non datur. If you are non-Boolean, you can have many ways. I mean, it's not you cannot build your logic on something like that. If a proposition A is true, then not A must be wrong. That doesn't hold anymore. And that's what brought Jung to believe in a kind of, let me say, metaphor that was already originally brought up by Nicholas of Cusa, the coincidentia oppositorum. So the coincidence of opposites, right? So you can, to make a long story short, you can, by these kinds of immanent experiences, you can have experiential access to a reality that is non-dual. That would be this kind of undivided universe. And in that universe, as Bohm phrases it, of course, there's always unfolding and enfolding going on. So in our terminology, making distinctions and taking them back, or breaking symmetries and restoring symmetries. So this is all different kinds of expressing the same thing. Now the interesting question that now may be the entry point for your question is, when you really are when you have an experience, or when there is an experience, I should say, which is immanent in that sense, in the sense of the non-dual, right? Then of course it's excluded by definition that a subject in the ordinary sense can have that experience, because the subject-object distinction is gone. There is no subject, right? So in a way, I think one way to address your question, how do subjects emerge against something that they are not? And then you can, for instance, play all the games with agents and so on. If you don't have subjects, you don't have agents in the usual sense. So yeah, I don't know. Of course, ultimately, I think I have no answer to your question, which goes into all details. But let me just raise one other analogy from the work of Schopenhauer. One of Schopenhauer's most important works is The World as Will and, what is it, Imagination? I don't know.
World as Will and Idea is the most common translation.
What?
World as Will and Idea.
Will and Idea, yeah. So Schopenhauer also has a kind of, in this work, he also has a kind of dual aspect of figure of thinking behind it, because for Schopenhauer, the will is something completely unpersonal. The will is what for Bohm would be the undivided universe, strangely. So this kind of will, of course, has nothing to do with an individual agent anymore. And Jung refers to that kind of will idea of Schopenhauer very often, actually. So it really depends on what your connotation with the notion of a will is, in order to, you know, address all this hugely difficult territory of concepts and connections between them and so on. Sorry, that was a little long. Was that a little bit, you know, at least?
A little bit. Can I have one minute, just
Tuvi, I do think we've got to move on. I'm sorry. I'm sure. Just because, you know, I think we can push. Andrew, should we push on till 1? We try and get more questions done. What do you think?
If we can, yeah, we'll just push it back by 15 minutes. That's fine.
Yeah, we'll just give an opportunity to ask more questions. And thanks for mentioning Schopenhauer, because I think that his idea that the ultimate reality is will with a capital W is really important, because I think he was a dual aspect monist. There's beautiful quotes from World of Will and Idea, which are perfect dual aspect monism, in my opinion.
I think so too. Yeah.
Wagner Allegretti.
Thank you. This is a question for Professor Harald. I would like to know if you're familiar with the work, the ideas of Federico Fagin, the Italo-American physicist.
I'm sorry, the work of who? Can you speak a bit louder?
Yes, Federico Fagin.
Fagin.
Yes, because he's a physicist, the inventor of the microprocessor. He had an experience of non-duality. I had many discussions with him personally, and he's creating a kind of model framework to explain consciousness, nature of reality, and I think it aligns very much with what you presented here today. So if you are not aware of his work, I know he published his book in Italy already, and now it's coming in English in the United States. Now it's more his personal experience, and then it's going to be the new ones about his model per se. It's just a suggestion because I think there is a possibility of, you know, mutual fertilization of ideas there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I know Fagin only by the name, and I know him as a person who has a lot of money, very wealthy, and sponsors research along the West Coast. But I don't know his framework of thinking very much.
Yes, so it's a suggestion. I know him. He is funding also my research with consciousness and fMRI. But before that, we were discussing about many of these ideas, and what I think is important, he was a physicist, you know, with that strict training, and then he had his non-dual cosmic consciousness expansion experience, and I think that makes this very relevant. Thank you. Congratulations for your presentation.
Wagner. Paul Kienowitz.
This is a question for both Peter and Professor Harald, and it's a question about the ego. And in his essay on Ramana Maharishi, Jung really questioned whether one could ever be free of the ego or whether it was even desirable. And he in fact felt that in the East, it was a bit of an illusion, this idea that the ego was going to disappear and that it wouldn't be there at all. And he felt, especially for Westerners from a different culture, that this was going to be, that this is really not possible. And in fact, he was fond of quoting St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, where St. Paul described his experiences going up through various levels until he reached the third heaven. And he wrote down, I, Paul, experienced these things. So you can't say that the self was absent. There has to be this experiencer, or else there is, or else, you know, what you got, you know, you have what Alan Watts would call the cosmic tapioca pudding, where there's basically, you know, everything is one and everything is nothing, you know. And I wondered if Peter and would address this question from the standpoint of non-duality, and maybe Harald from your knowledge of Jung.
I'll certainly do it from the point of view of non-duality, because it's a very important one. And it goes something like this. As you become non-dual, you lose the ego structures. And then it's common for people to say that you have perception without a perceiver, Now, this, of course, is something which we can't actually understand, because perception without a perceiver makes no sense, because perception in its form automatically defines that there is a perceiver to perceive. In fact, it's not like that, because the perceiver isn't there anymore. It's just the perception which arises. But is it perceived? Yes, it is. Then there must be a perceiver. No, there isn't. It's just the perception which is there. In other words, you are separate from the perception. There's nothing of your egoic function which is involved with the perception as it arises. So that's point one. Point two, there is quite clearly a graded hierarchy of people with ego functions. I can think of a lot of people who say they're non-dual, and I accept that they are, who have very strong ego functions, but they're different. And so the argument goes that as you go up the ladder, if you like, of non-duality, then your ego reforms, but in a different way. And I've got some very nice tapes from various people talking about just this very question, that is that the ego reforming. But when you get higher still, I love the sort of idea of a cosmic tapioca mess, because that's exactly the sort of place you get into. You get into resonances and you get into energies. And at this level that we are, it makes very little sense. So yes, there are egoic functions up to some level, but after that, then it's just simply the energy of the arising and falling, and that's it.
Thank you.
Maybe a little addition to that. I mean, you probably know that Jung has the notion of the ego and the notion of the self differently.
Yes. Yes.
And the self is, for Jung, always considered as something like an archetypal pattern, right? While the ego is one of the central concepts that an individual forms during development in its own mental domain. So it's not at the archetypal level, the ego. Now, what Jung insists is that some people misunderstand Jung by, by saying that an analytic treatment, if it is successful, you should lose your ego and become yourself. That's nonsense. I would go very much with Peter when he says, the contact that you can develop with your archetypal self is capable of reforming your ego in such a way that it becomes, I don't know, better adapted to, let's say, many things which I don't want to detail now. So it's really the interaction between them which makes all the difference. And if you are starting off with an inflated ego, as Jung calls it, then of course the interaction, the contact with your archetypal self might provide means in which you can establish a position for your ego that is more, let's say, realistic or more adapted to your environment, and so on and so on and so on.
Thank you.
Right. So, Jean McPhail.
Thank you for giving me another opportunity. I wanted to ask Professor Atmanspacher if he knows the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Have you heard of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras?
Yeah, I know them pretty well, yes.
Okay. Well, one of the things that he talks about is that there's a constant struggle in our psyche between, he doesn't use the term, what I would call concept and experience. That's the complementarity. And that the way we resolve that is through samadhi. And samadhi means a complete separation of the two and going down into the ground. And Vivekananda characterizes that ground as meaning. When you were talking about meaning, I thought, oh my goodness, this is so similar. And this is the process. You have this complementarity. Of course, you get to that through, this is the meditation yoga. There are other yogas, but this is, and through meditation, the goal of meditation is to separate the concept from the experience. Experience means just ordinary experience.
Oh yeah, I agree, yeah.
Go down into the wavical, I mean, that's the other word that they use, this undivided reality. And when you get that, you go into samadhi. And the product of samadhi is paranormal experience. I did a paper on this at some time back in Helsinki. I demonstrated that, and it's very interesting because there's 5 different levels, and the content of the non-local phenomena. If you are basically operating in the physical level, and you do this separation, you get a samadhi, you get things like bending spoons and stuff like that. If you're at a deeper level, the imaginal level, you begin to understand that's the non-local thing. And as you go up the hierarchy, which somebody was just talking about, a hierarchy in non-duality, that is that idea, the phenomena that you manifest become more and more expanded, so that at the very deepest level, you can see the whole universe. So I just thought that this was kind of an experiential model that is sort of fits in with a lot of what you were saying. It struck me very forcibly. I don't know if you agree.
Thanks. We have 3 minutes left. So if you want to put in a quick answer, and then perhaps we can take one more question.
Yeah, I might just say that there is a book that recently came out, I think 1 or 2 years ago, by Leanne Whitney, a Californian Jungian, and she, in that book, she lays out a very detailed comparison between Jung's psychology and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, right? That's very interesting. And one little remark about meaning again, at the level of the archetypes, of course, meaning is always implicit. Meaning becomes explicated or explicatable, or in Bohm's terminology, it can unfold if you have poles between which it can unfold, because meaning is relational. You need poles between which it sits, like a two-place relation, right? So at the archetypal level, meaning is not explicated in that way, but it's somehow, since this archetypal state must be is the origin of the unfolded meaning, this meaning must be somehow implicit at the
Thanks, Harald. Perhaps you could put the name of the book in the chat that you just mentioned there. Sounds very relevant.
Yeah, I can.
Margaret Moga, do you want to have a short one?
Can you unmute, Margaret?
Thank you. Can you, okay. I'm wondering if negative exceptional experiences are underreported, and if these fit the category of the dissociation phenomena of Harald. And also, and one quick example, I had a farmer who committed suicide this past summer, and 2 days later, a tornado hit that farm very specifically. And it was very exceptional to everyone who saw the phenomena, but it would not be reported in the exceptional experiences literature. Harald, your comments.
So, I mean, precognitive experiences would count as coincidence experiences because they generate some kind of correlation that usually would not be there, right? If you don't have this precognitive experience, then you cannot predict something like that. So there's an additional correlation coming up, right? So that would fall into exactly that category. And can you help me with the first part? I was just writing something down.
The negative, whether
yes,
negative
if you can have there's such a thing as a negative exceptional experience.
So the negative ones, you mean the dissociative ones, right? Below the baseline. Yes. I mean, in the dissociation experiences, you are still a mental. You experience yourself as a kind of mental agent, an ego. But what usually is correlated with this experience is just missing or disconnected. Like in out-of-body experiences, you are an experiencing ego, which is hovering above the bed in which your body lies as if it doesn't belong to you. So this would be the experience. Or in automatic, the surrealists at the beginning of the 20th century, they used these techniques of automatic writing or automatic painting or something. And this is again the same. So they experience themselves as an ego, but what their hands do is somehow disconnected from that ego. It's not intentional what they write. They just let their hands write. So again, this correlation is disconnected. So this is the bunch of phenomena that fall into that class. sleep
Okay,
paralysis.
thank you so much. And thank you to Harald, thank you to Peter for a fascinating morning. We've now got an hour for lunch, so perhaps, Andrew, perhaps you want to unmute everybody and everyone can show their thanks.
That sounds great. So everyone, you can unmute yourselves now and I'll put you onto gallery view and we can say thank you and to Harald and Peter for this morning's sessions.
Round of applause for Peter and Harald.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Very enriching.
And I hope you all have a lovely lunch. For those of you who are still on, can still hear me, just a quick plug for this afternoon. When I give my talk at 3:30, have a calculator with you, your phone will do, and a pair of headphones or some good computer speakers. It helps for the sonic element of the meditation to have good speakers or headphones. See you this afternoon.